Millionaire Caterer enters small-town Thanksgiving bake-off to conquer market. The ending brings a lesson he did not expect. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The morning sun cast a warm glow through the lace curtains of cozy crumbs, illuminating the rows of pastries that lined the counter. The soft hum of conversation and the occasional clink of a coffee cup created a familiar rhythm that calmed Emma Thompson's frayed nerves, at least for the moment. With dark curls escaping her loose ponytail and a streak of flour on her cheek, Emma moved with a practiced ease, handing out warm scones and smiles in equal measure. Despite the constant thrum of activity, the financial strain weighed heavily on her mind, threatening to crack her composed exterior. Cozy Crumbs had been in her family for generations, a cozy haven where her grandmother taught her to bake and share stories. Emma had inherited more than just recipes, she'd inherited the soul of the place, a legacy that connected her to the town and its people. But now, costs were rising, and bills piled up faster than she could manage. The warmth of the cafe felt like both a lifeline and a reminder of what was at stake. As she watched her regulars, Mrs. Whitaker, with her daily order of an apple tart, and Mr. Patel, sipping tea at his favorite corner table, Emma felt a twinge of hope that was as fragile as the porcelain cups they used. Across town, the gleaming facade of Maison Delights reflected a different world entirely. The sleek, modern lines and pristine glass windows were as precise as the man who owned it, Victor Reynolds. He stepped out of a black luxury car, its paint as polished as his image. His suit, perfectly tailored, spoke of money and control, two things Victor had mastered over years of relentless ambition. His ice-blue eyes scanned his newest establishment with satisfaction. Expanding his empire had become second nature, and Willow Creek was merely the next piece in his strategy. Victor's rise had been meteoric, starting with a modest cafe in New York and transforming into an empire of upscale catering businesses known for impeccable presentation and a dash of exclusivity. But his success wasn't without consequence. Stories of small, family-run bakeries closing their doors in the wake of his expansions were whispered in the quiet corners of every town he entered. Victor considered it collateral, part of the game. To him, emotions were just another variable to control. He walked into Maison Delights with an air of confidence, nodding at Marina, his assistant, who met him with a clipboard in hand. Her crisp efficiency mirrored his own, each step and decision a calculated move. The latest numbers looked promising, Marina began, but Victor's attention had already shifted. His eyes caught the simple, homey feel of Main Street outside the window, a stark contrast to the polished interior of his new space. For just a heartbeat, he felt the echo of an old memory, a kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and his grandmother's laughter. He dismissed it as quickly as it appeared. Sentiment had no place in his world. Good. Make sure we maintain momentum, he said, voice clipped and businesslike. He turned his back to the view, focusing on the pristine counters and spotless glass displays. This was where he thrived, in environments he could control, surrounded by the trappings of his success. At Cozy Crumbs, Emma wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the window at the quiet bustle of Main Street. The sun reflected off the sign of Maison Delights in the distance, its shiny newness almost taunting in its presence. She'd heard the murmurs in the community about the new place, about Victor Reynolds, and the ripples his arrival had already started to create. But Cozy Crumbs was more than a business, it was a heartbeat, a place where stories were shared, and neighbors felt like family. Willow Creek came alive each November with a familiar excitement. Streets were lined with pumpkins, hay bales, and twinkling lights that promised the warmth of the holidays to come. Among these cherished traditions was the annual Thanksgiving Bake-Off, a competition that gathered everyone from seasoned bakers to enthusiastic newcomers. The bake-off wasn't just about winning, it was a celebration of the town's heart and its love for baking, a tradition rooted in generations of shared recipes and family gatherings. Emma stood outside Cozy Crumbs, watching as volunteers strung festive banners across Main Street. For a moment, she let herself get lost in the memory of her grandmother's voice, laughing and calling out last-minute changes to her pie recipe as they'd prepared for the competition years ago. The nostalgia filled Emma with a bittersweet sense of longing, but this time, the stakes were higher. Winning wasn't just about pride or community spirit, it was her only shot at keeping the cafe alive. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar blend of hope and nerves settle in her chest. The announcement of the bake-off spread through town like the sweet aroma of cookies in an oven. Mrs. Whitaker was already discussing her plans for an experimental pear tart with her friends, while younger bakers whispered excitedly about secret techniques and flavor combinations. Emma could feel the buzz even before she stepped inside her cafe, where a group of regulars were already talking about potential contestants. "You'll enter, won't you, Emma?" Mr. Patel asked, his eyes kind and hopeful. Emma nodded, pushing aside the doubt that tried to creep in. "I have to, don't I?" she said with a small smile. She didn't need to explain why. They all knew. The bills, the challenges, the way her eyes sometimes lingered on the for sale signs in the windows of other closed shops. Winning this competition would mean publicity, respect, and a prize large enough to keep Cozy Crumbs running through the winter. In her mind, she could already see the recipe cards scattered across her kitchen counter, feel the comforting rhythm of rolling out dough and mixing spices. This was where she belonged, and she wasn't going down without a fight. News of Victor Reynolds' entry into the bake-off, however, fell on Willow Creek like a thunderclap. The chatter around town shifted from excitement to wary surprise, eyes darting toward the polished facade of Maison Delights. It wasn't long before whispers of "why would he join, and isn't this just for local bakers," spread through the town like ripples in a pond. Emma learned the news from her friend Sarah, who burst through the cafe doors with a flurry of energy. "Emma, did you hear? Victor Reynolds is entering the bake-off," Sarah said, her voice pitched with disbelief. Emma's brows knit together as she set down a bowl of batter. "Why would someone like him care about a small-town event?" she muttered, half to herself. But she knew the answer. For Victor, this was a stage, another platform to showcase his brand and edge out any hint of competition. The thought left a sour taste in her mouth. Meanwhile, Victor stood in Maison Delights, a smile that bordered on predatory, curving his lips. He listened as Marina relayed the final details of their entry, nodding with calculated enthusiasm. The bake-off was not just a marketing opportunity, it was a chance to stamp his name across Willow Creek, leaving no room for doubt about who dominated the culinary scene. He didn't care about traditions or the warmth that the event fostered. To him, it was another battlefield, another place to win. The day Victor's participation was announced, the air seemed to change. Emma could feel it when she stepped out of the cafe and saw the looks exchanged between townspeople. The familiar was now tinged with uncertainty, a challenge unlike any they'd faced before. But it also sparked something deep within her, a determination that simmered like the first bubbles of caramel on the stove. Emma returned to the kitchen that evening, the quiet punctuated only by the steady thud of her rolling pin against dough. She worked with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for doubt or fear. If Victor Reynolds thought he could walk into this town and sweep up their traditions like another acquisition, he'd have to go through her first. The following morning, the announcement was made official in the town square. A large chalkboard listed the contestants' names, and at the bottom, in bold letters that seemed to glare back at her, was Maison Delights, Victor Reynolds. The crowd stirred, voices overlapping in confusion and excitement. Emma stood a little taller, eyes meeting the name on the board as if in silent challenge. She could almost see Victor smirk, even though he was nowhere in sight. "Well, Cozy Crumbs," she whispered, wiping her hands on her apron, "it's us against the world now." The evening light filtered into Cozy Crumbs, casting a warm glow over the flour-dusted countertops and trays of half-finished pastries. Emma stood at her workbench, eyes focused and hands moving rhythmically as she rolled out dough for the 5th time that day. The kitchen was cluttered with bowls of ingredients, recipe cards marked with hasty notes, and a scattering of spices that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. She could hear the soft murmur of customers in the front room, a comforting backdrop that reminded her why she was doing this. But exhaustion clung to her like a heavy coat, and her fingers ached from hours of relentless work. "Emma, when's the last time you took a break?" Sarah's voice cut through the kitchen's gentle chaos as she leaned against the doorframe with a knowing look. Emma pushed a stray curl away from her face, leaving a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Can't remember," she admitted with a tired smile. "But this pie isn't going to perfect itself." She glanced at the cooling rack crowded with test batches, each one carrying a slightly different twist, a touch more brown sugar here, a hint of cardamom there. Sarah's eyes softened. "We're all rooting for you, you know. Just don't forget to root for yourself." A pang of gratitude surged through Emma as she turned back to her work. The community's faith in her kept her going, but so did the quiet fear that whispered doubts late at night when the cafe was still, and only the hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. Meanwhile, at Maison Delights, the scene was strikingly different. Polished chrome gleamed under the bright, sterile light of the kitchen. Victor stood at the center, a composed figure in a suit that looked more at home at a board meeting than in a kitchen. Surrounding him, a team of chefs worked with mechanical efficiency, whisking and measuring under his watchful eye. They moved like parts of a well-oiled machine, their faces set in concentration as they executed recipes with clinical precision. Victor's voice cut through the kitchen, crisp and commanding. "Presentation is key. If it doesn't look perfect, it's not leaving this kitchen." He didn't touch the ingredients, he directed, observed, and corrected. To him, the bake-off was a calculated move, another rung in the ladder of dominance. Winning meant expanding his empire, showcasing his brand, and reinforcing his reputation as the best. Sentiment had no place here. This was about control, about winning, not about the stories behind the flour and sugar. Outside of the cafe and the high-end kitchens, Willow Creek's farmers' market was in full swing, its stalls brimming with the bright colors of seasonal produce. Emma loved this place. It was where she found inspiration and connected with the growers who'd been supplying her with ingredients since she first opened Cozy Crumbs. She walked from stall to stall, selecting apples and sniffing bundles of cinnamon sticks as the familiar faces of vendors greeted her warmly. "Emma, those are the best batch of Honeycrisps we've had all season," called Mr. Lyle, holding up a glossy, red apple with pride. "Perfect for pies," Emma replied, pocketing the apple and adding a few more to her bag. Just as she turned to pay, the air seemed to shift, and a sudden hush fell over the nearby vendors. Victor Reynolds stood at the entrance of the market, his tailored coat an odd contrast against the homespun feel of the place. His sharp eyes scanned the market as if he were appraising a potential acquisition rather than enjoying an autumn morning. The crowd seemed to part as he moved, some watching with curiosity, others with unease. Emma stiffened when their eyes met. The world around them faded for just a moment, replaced by the sharp line between competition and resolve. "Emma Thompson, I presume?" Victor's voice carried a cool, polite tone that barely masked his curiosity. Up close, he seemed more imposing, every inch the confident businessman. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "And you must be Victor Reynolds. Surprised you shop for ingredients yourself." The words had an edge that hinted at both challenge and disbelief. He smirked, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "I like to know the quality of what I'm up against." Emma's fingers tightened around her bag of apples. "It's not just quality that matters," she said softly, but firmly. "It's heart." Victor's smirk faltered for just a moment before he brushed it off. "We'll see about that." He moved past her, the space between them crackling with a tension that was new and undeniable. Emma watched him go, the encounter leaving her pulse racing with a mixture of irritation and something else she couldn't quite name. She turned back to Mr. Lyle, who raised an eyebrow as if to ask if she was okay. Emma gave him a small nod and managed to smile, though inside, the stakes of the competition felt heavier than ever. As Victor strolled through the market, scanning ingredients as if making mental notes, a memory flashed unbidden in his mind, a day in his grandmother's kitchen when he'd once felt joy in the simple act of mixing dough. He pushed it aside, dismissing it as irrelevant. Sentiment could wait. Right now, he had a competition to win. The days leading up to the bake-off were a flurry of activity at Cozy Crumbs. Emma worked tirelessly, her apron smudged with flour and her hair slipping free from its ponytail more often than not. Yet, she wasn't alone. Word of her efforts spread, and soon, the townspeople began showing up at her doorstep, their arms full of supplies and words of encouragement. Mrs. Whitaker came by one afternoon, a bag of freshly picked apples in hand. "Thought you could use these, dear. They're from my brother's orchard, sweet as can be." Emma's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. These are perfect. Now, don't you wear yourself out, Emma. The whole town is rooting for you," the older woman said, squeezing her arm gently before heading out. Even Mr. Patel, who was known more for his quiet presence than grand gestures, appeared with a jar of imported cinnamon. "I brought you something special. Thought it might add a touch to your pies," he said with a shy smile. Emma felt a lump in her throat as she looked around her kitchen, now bustling with bags of flour, eggs from local farmers, and handwritten notes of encouragement pinned to the walls. The community's support was more than she could have hoped for, a tangible reminder that she wasn't facing this challenge alone. For the first time in weeks, the pressure in her chest loosened, replaced by a warmth that made the long hours worthwhile. While Cozy Crumbs thrived on kindness and shared efforts, Maison Delights remained a fortress of precision and routine. One afternoon, however, Victor found himself back at the farmer's market, intending to oversee last-minute ingredient selection. He walked with his usual air of detached confidence, barely acknowledging the nods and glances that followed him. As he perused a stall selling various herbs, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Excuse me, young man, looking for something special?" The voice belonged to an elderly baker, her silver hair pulled back in a simple braid. Her eyes twinkled with a wisdom that seemed to cut through the polished veneer Victor wore. Victor's brow arched slightly. "Just ensuring I have the best for an upcoming event," he said, his tone polite but distant. The woman chuckled, a sound warm and full of life. "Ah, always chasing perfection, are you? Funny thing about baking, it's as much about feeling as it is about measurements. You can have the finest ingredients and the best technique, but if your heart's not in it, the bread will know." Victor's smile was tight, almost rehearsed. "I assure you, I know how to win." "I'm sure you do, son," she said, her expression softening. "But do you remember why you started?" She patted his arm gently, before moving on, leaving Victor staring after her with an unexpected knot in his chest. He shook off the moment, dismissing it as an odd encounter, but the question lingered. Why had he started? The memory surfaced reluctantly, like a whisper, the small kitchen where he'd first learned to bake, his grandmother laughing as flour dusted the tip of his nose. Back then, baking was simple, joyful, a world away from the empire he'd built. Victor forced the memory down, focusing instead on the ingredients he needed, but a flicker of doubt settled stubbornly at the edge of his mind. Back at Cozy Crumbs, Emma's kitchen had become a bustling scene of flour-covered counters and laughter. Sarah popped in with a jar of wild honey, adding it to the growing collection of contributions. "Emma, you're going to win this." "I can feel it," Sarah said, handing over the jar and giving her friend a quick hug. Emma smiled, wiping a tear that threatened to spill. "Win or not, I already feel like I have. Just look at this place," she said, gesturing to the handwritten notes taped to the walls, each one carrying words of support from the town's residents. The warmth in her voice carried a resilience that echoed the heart of Willow Creek itself. Later that evening, as Emma rolled out her pie crust one last time before closing up for the night, Victor sat in his office at Maison Delights, surrounded by spreadsheets and plans. The glow from his desk lamp cast shadows that seemed to deepen the crease in his brow. The elderly baker's words came back to him unwelcome and insistent. He pushed back from his desk, suddenly restless, and paced the room. He hadn't felt this way in years, this nagging uncertainty that whispered he might have lost something along the way. He glanced at an old photograph on his shelf, nearly forgotten, himself as a young boy, flour on his face and a wide grin as he stood next to his grandmother. The picture seemed out of place among the sleek decor, a relic of a time he no longer allowed himself to dwell on. He picked it up, traced the edges, and for the first time in a long while, wondered if the old baker had been right. The morning of the bake-off dawned crisp and bright, with the sky painted in shades of soft blue and gold. The town square of Willow Creek buzzed with life as stalls were set up, tables were draped in checkered cloths, and the rich, heady scent of cinnamon and nutmeg mingled with the cool November air. Children wove between the legs of their parents, their laughter bubbling like the cider simmering at one corner of the square. The bake-off was more than just a competition, it was an event that wove the town together, a day for stories, shared smiles, and the taste of something familiar. Emma stood behind her table, adjusting the delicate fluted edges of her pumpkin pie, making sure everything was just right. She glanced up and met the eyes of Mrs. Whitaker, who gave her a supportive nod from the crowd. Sarah appeared at her side with a cup of tea, offering a look of encouragement. "First round nerves?" Sarah asked. Emma chuckled softly. "A little. But more than anything, I'm ready." Across the square, the Maison Delights team moved like a well-coordinated dance. Victor stood at the center, observing his chefs as they put the final touches on their dessert, a layered pumpkin and spiced mousse creation that looked as immaculate as it did complex. He wore a practiced expression of calm, but today, a small, nagging feeling lingered beneath the surface. As the bake-off was announced and the participants were introduced, a cheer rippled through the crowd. Families huddled closer, and the judges took their seats at a table adorned with golden leaves and autumn flowers. The first round was all about pumpkin-themed desserts, a fitting nod to the season. Emma drew in a deep breath as the judge called her forward. She stepped up, presenting her simple pumpkin pie with a caramel glaze. It wasn't as flashy as the layered creations from the bigger establishments, but it was made with care, using the fresh ingredients from Mr. Lyle's stall and a recipe passed down from her grandmother. The first bite melted across the judges' tongues, eliciting murmurs of delight that spread through the crowd like warmth from a fireplace. Victor's team followed shortly, revealing their intricate dessert, individual glass cups layered with pumpkin mousse, ginger crumble, and candied orange zest. It gleamed under the soft light, each cup a testament to skill and precision. The judges nodded approvingly, though their smiles were more measured, their eyes wandering to Emma's table even after the tasting. Emma stepped back into the crowd, the adrenaline coursing through her making every noise sharper, every face clearer. She caught Victor's gaze from across the square, and for a moment, she wondered what he thought of her humble offering. Victor's expression was unreadable, but as he watched her interact with the townspeople, laughing, sharing memories of past bake-offs, offering bites to children with eager eyes, something shifted. He saw what he hadn't wanted to admit before. While his team's dessert was a masterpiece in precision, it lacked the spirit that infused Emma's work. She stood there, sleeves rolled up, hands still dusted with flour, completely at ease amidst the crowd. Her table wasn't just a station, it was an invitation, a reminder of shared moments and simpler joys. Victor turned back to his team, his jaw tightening. The sound of applause brought his attention to the judges, who were discussing their thoughts in hushed tones. The first round's results would be shared later in the day, giving the bakers a brief reprieve to mingle and prepare for the next stage. "Emma, that was beautiful," said Mrs. Whitaker, appearing at her side once more. "Just like your grandmother used to make." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," Emma said, her voice a little shaky now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She caught Victor's gaze again, but this time, he didn't look away. There was something different in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity, or maybe recognition. He made his way toward her, weaving through the chatter and laughter of the crowd. The noise seemed to dip slightly as he approached, the townspeople watching the exchange with interest. "Emma Thompson," he said, his voice steady but lacking the earlier aloofness. "Your pie was impressive." The compliment surprised her, and she raised an eyebrow. "Thank you. I'm sure your team put out something incredible." A muscle in his jaw flexed. "Yes, but it's clear there's more to this than I originally thought." His eyes moved over the crowd, taking in the way they gravitated around Emma's table, and then back to her. "It's more than just the dessert, isn't it?" Emma's smile softened, catching him off guard. "It always has been." For the first time in years, Victor felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. A memory of laughter, the warmth of baking in a kitchen that was far from perfect, but full of love. He didn't know what to do with it, so he simply nodded and stepped back, retreating to the polished calm of his station. Emma watched him go, puzzled but too caught up in the moment to dwell on it. Sarah sidled up next to her, a teasing smile playing at her lips. "Well, that was unexpected." Emma let out a small laugh. "Yeah. But I think today's full of surprises." The day unfolded with stories shared among neighbors, bites of pumpkin desserts, and the chatter of excitement that refused to die down. It wasn't just the competition that made the event special, it was the gathering of friends and the sense that, at least for a day, the town was a little closer, a little warmer. Emma felt it in every smile and every handshake, and she knew that whatever the outcome, this was the spirit she baked for. The second day of the bake-off began with a crisp, autumn chill and the gentle rustle of leaves skittering across the town square. Emma arrived at Cozy Crumbs early, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She made her way inside and prepared her station with the meticulous care she always practiced. Today's challenge was crucial, and the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. She checked and rechecked her ingredients, her fingers trailing across the familiar jars and tins. But as she reached for the cinnamon, her heart sank, it was nearly empty. A wave of disbelief washed over her as she searched every corner of her supplies. She remembered Mr. Patel's special jar of imported cinnamon and realized she had used more than she intended the day before. Panic started to creep in, but before it could take hold, the bell above the cafe store jingled. Sarah, ever perceptive, took one look at Emma's face and crossed the room in seconds. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her tone somewhere between worry and resolve. "The cinnamon." "I'm almost out," Emma whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't hesitate. "I'll go talk to Mr. Lyle. He might have some in his stock at the market." Before Emma could protest, Sarah was already out the door. The minutes that followed felt like hours as Emma tried to focus, prepping the rest of her ingredients and willing herself to stay calm. Just when she thought she couldn't take the tension any longer, the door burst open again, this time with Mr. Patel, Mrs. Whitaker, and Sarah hurrying in, triumphantly holding up a small, paper-wrapped bundle. "Fresh cinnamon sticks," Mr. Patel said, a proud smile on his face. "We weren't going to let you down." Emotion surged in Emma's chest as she took the bundle. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without all of you." Mrs. Whitaker patted her arm. "You'd do just fine, dear. But it never hurts to have a few friends in your corner." With her cinnamon problem solved and a renewed sense of energy, Emma set to work, her hands moving deftly as she created her apple cinnamon tart. The scent filled the cafe, mingling with the light streaming through the window. Outside, she could hear the faint hum of the crowd gathering for the mid-morning round, and the familiar sound grounded her. Victor watched the activity from the other side of the square, his eyes catching the bustle in Emma's cafe as he sipped a coffee that had long gone cold. He'd heard about her setback through whispers and seen the townspeople rush to help. A pang of something unfamiliar stirred in him, something that felt suspiciously like admiration. He shifted uncomfortably, the memory of his grandmother's kitchen creeping back into his mind. It had been a tiny space, more cluttered than any of his pristine kitchens now. But it had been warm, filled with laughter and the scent of nutmeg. Back then, baking wasn't a competition, it was a language of love, of shared afternoons and recipes scribbled in looping handwriting. He glanced down at the untouched drink in his hand and wondered when that warmth had turned cold in his pursuit of success. The judges called Emma's name, and she stepped forward, carefully placing her tart on the table. Its golden crust shimmered with a light glaze, and the aroma wrapped around the judges like a gentle embrace. As they tasted, Emma spoke, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "This recipe belonged to my grandmother," she began, eyes meeting each judge's with quiet conviction. "She taught me that baking isn't just about ingredients. It's about the hands that work the dough, the laughter in the kitchen, and the stories shared around the table. Cozy Crumbs was her dream, and it's my privilege to carry that dream forward." The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like the warmth of a shared blanket. Even Victor, watching from the sidelines, felt the pull of her sincerity. It was a stark contrast to the way he had approached his entry, with clinical precision, detached and efficient. He looked back at his own table, where his chefs were reviewing their checklist, oblivious to the heart that was unfolding a few feet away. Emma stepped back as the judges murmured among themselves, their smiles more genuine this time, eyes lingering on the simple beauty of her tart. The applause that followed was hearty and real, sweeping through the crowd like a wave. Emma felt her cheeks flush, but it wasn't just from the praise, it was from the sense that she had made her grandmother proud. Victor's chest tightened, the echoes of old laughter pressing against the walls of his memory. For the first time, he questioned whether winning this competition was enough. What was the point if the victory came without heart? He took a step back from his table, the noise of the square blurring into the background as he stared at the bustling crowd. Emma had something he hadn't realized he'd lost, a connection to the reason they all started baking in the first place. Emma met his gaze across the square, her expression unreadable but not unkind. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, shared understanding. For a fleeting moment, Victor let himself feel it, the bittersweet sting of knowing that success alone could never replace what she had so effortlessly brought to life. The air was electric with anticipation as the final round of the bake-off approached. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light across the town square and warming the faces of the crowd gathered to watch. Stalls were packed with families sipping cider, their eyes fixed on the center stage where the final 2 tables were set. Emma stood behind hers, the familiar sense of cinnamon and nutmeg grounding her, while Victor stood across from her, his face thoughtful, almost introspective. This round was everything. Each baker was tasked with presenting a signature Thanksgiving dessert, a dish that captured the essence of the holiday in every bite. For Emma, the decision had been simple. She would make her grandmother's rustic apple cinnamon pie, a recipe that held the warmth of shared moments and whispered stories. She'd made it countless times in the kitchen of Cozy Crumbs, but today, it felt like an offering, her heart in pastry form. She moved with careful precision, peeling apples and mixing them with sugar and spices until the scent wrapped around her like a familiar hug. The dough came together under her practiced hands, the golden crust already promising the flakiness that her grandmother had taught her to perfect. Emma glanced at the crowd and caught sight of Mr. Patel, Mrs. Whitaker, and Sarah. Their encouraging smiles pushed away the nerves threatening to overtake her. Victor, meanwhile, stood before an array of ingredients, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. The night before, he'd gone through every possible version of a complex dessert, pumpkin soufflés with caramel drizzles, layered tarts topped with sponge sugar. But today, the voices of his team fell away. He didn't want their practiced hands and flawless precision, he wanted the simplicity of flour and warmth, the joy he'd known before ambition had taken over. He turned to his chefs, their eyes wide with surprise as he spoke. "I'll be doing this one myself," Victor said, rolling up his sleeves. The room stilled as the realization hit that Victor Reynolds was stepping out from behind the safety of his brand. No perfectly orchestrated team, no calculated designs, just him. His hands moved methodically as he started to work the dough. Memories filtered in unbidden, the feel of his grandmother's hand guiding his, the flour smudged across his small fingers. The room seemed to blur, and for the first time in years, Victor felt at peace in the act of baking, not for applause, not for a contract, but simply for the creation itself. The crowd watched, intrigued by this unexpected turn. Emma noticed it, too, her brows lifting as she saw Victor's usually rigid posture soften, his focus shifting to the act rather than the outcome. There was something different in the way he kneaded the dough, the way he sprinkled spices, with a touch of nostalgia in his eyes. A moment passed between them, unspoken but clear, as if they were sharing a secret only bakers would understand. As the time wound down, the tension in the square thickened. Emma placed the final braid of dough across her pie, brushed it with egg wash, and slid it into the oven. The scent of apples and cinnamon bloomed around her, mingling with the chatter and anticipation. Victor worked with a similar fervor, a dish taking shape that, while elegant, held the comfort of a simpler past, a pumpkin tart infused with spiced pear and a delicate layer of pecan praline. The judges approached with notebooks in hand and eyes that shone with expectation. First, they visited Victor's table. He presented his tart with an uncharacteristic humility, the layers gleaming and perfectly constructed. The judges tasted, their faces a study in concentration. They nodded, impressed by the complexity and the play of flavors. Then it was Emma's turn. She stepped forward, nerves and pride mixing in her chest, and set down her rustic pie. Its crust was golden, adorned with a few carefully cut leaves, and the filling bubbled slightly at the edges. The first judge cut a slice, and the sound of the knife gliding through the flaky crust seemed to echo in the space. When the fork reached their mouths, the judges' eyes softened, and small, involuntary smiles appeared. It wasn't just taste, it was memory, comfort, a story in every bite. The crowd murmured, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Emma's chest tightened, and she felt Sarah's hand on her shoulder, grounding her as the judges whispered to one another. When the head judge stood, the square fell silent. "Both of these desserts were remarkable," he began. Victor's tart was executed with unparalleled skill and attention to detail, a testament to his expertise. There was polite applause, and Victor nodded, but his eyes were on Emma. The judge continued, turning to her. "Emma's pie reminded us why we gather on Thanksgiving. It was more than just a dessert, it was a reminder of home, of warmth shared and passed down." The applause this time was immediate, swelling into cheers. Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she smiled so wide it hurt. Victor felt a strange tug at his heart, an unexpected release of the tension that had gripped him for years. He joined in the applause, genuine and unreserved. Emma walked over, unsure of what to say, but knowing this moment needed words. "Victor, your dish was beautiful," she said, and meant it. "And your pie," he replied, a small, real smile breaking through, "was everything I didn't know I missed." The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over Willow Creek, draping the town square in a light as soft as a blanket. The judges stood huddled, their voices a quiet hum as they deliberated. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, the festive decorations swaying gently in the breeze as if they, too, were waiting for the announcement. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, fingers trembling with anticipation. She stole a glance at Sarah, who mouthed, "You've got this," with an encouraging nod. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, a wild mix of hope and disbelief. The head judge stepped forward, clearing his throat and commanding the square's attention. His gaze swept over the crowd before landing on Emma and Victor, who stood on either side of the stage. After careful consideration, we've made our decision, he began, the weight of the moment pressing down like a tangible force. The judge's eyes met Emma's, and a smile broke through his serious expression. The winner of this year's Thanksgiving Bake-Off is Emma Thompson, with her heartwarming apple cinnamon pie. A heartbeat of stunned silence followed before the square erupted into cheers. The noise surged, wrapping Emma in its warmth. Tears pricked at her eyes as relief flooded her body. Mrs. Whitaker was clapping with a vigor that belied her age, and Mr. Patel raised his hands in applause, his eyes shining with pride. Emma's vision blurred as she took it all in, the love, the joy, the belief that the town had shown her. "Emma, you did it," Sarah said, rushing to her side with an embrace that nearly knocked the breath out of her. Emma laughed, a tear spilling down her cheek, and hugged her friend back, letting the emotion wash over her. Victor stepped forward, his applause steady and sincere. The usual sharpness in his eyes had softened, and for the first time, there was no calculating edge to his smile. He extended a hand to Emma, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. "Congratulations, Emma," he said, his voice low but genuine. "You deserved this. Your pie, it was more than just a dessert. It reminded me why I started baking in the first place." Emma searched his face, finding a man who seemed different from the one she'd faced at the start of the competition. "Thank you, Victor," she said, squeezing his hand before letting go. "And your tart was beautiful. Truly." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, something between regret and newfound understanding. "This has been more than a competition for me, too," he admitted, glancing at the crowd that had rallied around Emma. "Your dedication, the way you put your heart into everything, it's something I lost along the way." Emma's expression softened. There was something genuine about the way he spoke, a humility she hadn't expected. "Well," she said, eyes twinkling, "there's a town dinner tonight to celebrate. Why don't you join us? I think it's about time you see how we do Thanksgiving in Willow Creek." Victor looked surprised, his eyebrows lifting slightly before his mouth curved into a small smile. "I'd like that," he said, the words carrying the weight of acceptance, as if he were letting go of something heavy he'd carried for too long. The sun dipped lower, and the square began to empty as townspeople moved toward the community hall where the feast was being set up. The hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of utensils filled the air, painting the evening with warmth. Tables overflowed with platters of roasted vegetables, pies, and dishes, contributed by everyone in town. Candles flickered in the center of each table, their light reflecting in the eyes of friends and neighbors. Emma took a seat near the head of the longest table, feeling the energy of the room settle around her like an embrace. Victor found a spot across from her, a look of curiosity replacing his usual calculated demeanor. He watched as children giggled over bowls of mashed potatoes and older couples reminisced about bake-offs past. It was an atmosphere he hadn't felt in years, a gathering not for business, but for the simple joy of being together. Mr. Patel lifted a glass, calling for a toast. "To Emma, for reminding us that it's not just the ingredients or the technique that makes something special, it's the love we put into it." The crowd echoed his sentiment, with raised glasses, cheers, and a few hearty claps. Emma's face flushed with gratitude, her heart swelling as she met Victor's gaze across the table. He lifted his glass slightly in her direction, a silent toast shared between them, one that carried understanding and, perhaps, the beginning of a friendship. As the evening continued, Emma caught Victor listening intently as Mrs. Whitaker recounted stories of the town's bake-off legends, a smile breaking through his usually composed expression. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Looks like the mighty Victor Reynolds is learning what it's like to be part of something more." Emma nodded, her eyes lingering on Victor as he laughed at a joke told by one of the younger bakers. The town's energy, the spirit of Thanksgiving, had reached him. And in that moment, Emma knew that winning the competition was only part of the story. The real victory was seeing how far they had all come, from isolation to togetherness, from rivalry to respect. And so, the night unfolded in laughter, shared stories, and the clink of dessert forks against plates. It was the kind of evening that promised memories to last long after the candles had burned down and the plates were cleared away. The community hall glowed under the soft lights strung from the rafters, their golden glow mingling with the warm flicker of candles on each table. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, punctuated by the clink of forks and the occasional cheer as someone toasted to Emma and cozy crumbs. Long tables were laden with dishes, from steaming casseroles to platters of roasted vegetables and, of course, an array of pies. The air was rich with the aromas of baked apples, cinnamon, and roasted turkey, embracing everyone in a comforting, festive hug. Emma stood near the main table, soaking in the sight of friends and neighbors talking and sharing stories. The tension and stress of the past weeks had melted away, replaced by the deep, fulfilling sense of accomplishment that came not just from winning the bake-off, but from knowing the cafe was safe, surrounded by the very people who had lifted her when she needed it most. Sarah handed her a plate piled with food and shot her a mischievous grin. "You're going to sit down and eat, or I'm making an announcement," Sarah teased, nudging Emma toward a seat. Emma laughed, the sound light and free. I'm going, she promised, settling into a chair next to Mr. Patel, who raised his glass in a silent toast. Across the table, Victor sat, still dressed in his suit but with the top button undone and a relaxed air about him. His usual composed exterior had softened, he looked less like the formidable business mogul and more like someone who had found a piece of home. As the evening settled into a comfortable rhythm, Victor stood up, clearing his throat. The conversations quieted, and the room turned its attention to him. He looked around, eyes landing on Emma and then moving across the room, taking in the faces of those who had gathered. "I wanted to thank all of you for allowing me to be a part of today," he began, a hint of hesitation in his voice that made it all the more genuine. "I've spent years building my business, focused only on numbers and the next goal. But being here, seeing how this community comes together, reminded me of why I fell in love with baking in the first place." He paused, glancing down as if the next words were coming from a place long forgotten. "My grandmother taught me how to bake when I was just a boy. Her kitchen was small, messy, full of laughter. Somewhere along the way, I lost that." His eyes met Emma's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "But today, I felt it again. And for that, I have you to thank, Emma." The room filled with soft murmurs, and Emma felt a rush of emotion she hadn't expected. Victor took a breath, the last of his formality giving way to sincerity. "I'd like to support this town and its small businesses moving forward. And, if you're willing," he said, directing his attention fully to Emma, "I'd love to collaborate with you, featuring your pies in my catering venues. Your baking deserves to be known far and wide, and I'd be honored to help make that happen." Emma's eyes widened, and then a slow, delighted smile spread across her face. "Victor, that's more than I could have imagined. I'd be thrilled." The applause that erupted was filled with genuine joy, the kind that comes from witnessing something hopeful and true. Mrs. Whitaker dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, and Mr. Patel clapped so hard, his glass nearly tipped over. Even Sarah, who was rarely without words, stood there grinning from ear to ear. Victor sat down, the weight of old pressures seeming to lift from his shoulders. He turned to Emma with a smile that no longer carried the sharpness of ambition but the warmth of someone who had found his way back to something precious. The feast continued, stories and laughter weaving through the room. Emma and Victor shared anecdotes of their baking mishaps, hers about the time she'd mixed up salt and sugar, his about the first cake he'd baked solo that had emerged from the oven as hard as a brick. The stories were met with roars of laughter, the room filling with a camaraderie that was as nourishing as the food on their plates. As the night deepened, the chatter turned softer, punctuated by the clatter of plates being cleared and the final strains of a local musician playing a fiddle by the window. Emma glanced at the candlelight reflecting in Victor's eyes and knew this Thanksgiving would be the start of something new, not just for her, but for the town, and even for Victor. When the crowd began to spill out into the town square, families lingered under the soft glow of strings of lights, their breath visible in the crisp air. The square was alive with children chasing each other, couples holding hands, and neighbors exchanging stories and laughter. The warmth of the night carried on, spilling from the hall into the heart of Willow Creek itself. Emma stood by the doorway, watching the scene unfold, her heart full. Victor joined her, a silence settling between them that was as comfortable as it was meaningful. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," he said, looking out over the square. "I'm glad you stayed," Emma replied, eyes catching his in a moment of shared understanding. "And Victor? Welcome to Willow Creek." Out over the town, lights were twinkling like stars, the laughter of families and friends rising into the night. The spirit of Thanksgiving wrapped around them all, a reminder that home is found not just in places, but in people, and sometimes, even in the most unexpected moments.